Angel MD is essentially the community for healthcare innovation, right? We want to support all innovation across the entire healthcare ecosystem. And so for rare diseases and the parents and the patients therein, we're certainly interested and focused on that topic, but how do we apply innovation and all of this type of stuff in order to solve real problems for these kids and for these families? And so how do we then take the lessons that we learn from one area and apply it to many others? You know, that's what a community is about, is sharing learned knowledge, right? Sharing received wisdom. And how do we share that with as many people as possible to generate as much of positive impact as possible?
There are hundreds of rare diseases that do not have treatments that can be treated with gene therapy. Our insurance companies don't like the idea of paying for $1 million treatment. But you look at these patients and what it is, these kids, to go through all the healthcare providers that they do when they're in the hospital and in the emergency room, getting their MRIs, getting their anesthesia. It adds up very, very fast. And on top of that, you're also saving a child's life. Jonah was born in 2008. He was born asymptomatic. On his first year well visit, he noted that Jonah's head size was off the chart. And he recommended that we go see a neurologist. She was extremely thorough. And then she passed us off to a geneticist and suggested that we should go see an MRI, go get an MRI too. My husband and I were pretty shocked by this. Like, what do you mean? What do you see here?
Did either you or your husband have any medical background before this?
No, my background is in fashion. My husband's is in film.
So all of a sudden you're thrown into a very complicated world.
Yeah, what is going on here? We're trying not to panic. We go and get the MRI and think nothing of it at this time. It's like, it's all water under the bridge. And then our neurologist calls us in and we're like, okay. And we get to the elevator and she's standing right next to us and she's like, excuse me. And she takes the stairs. We're like, whoa. So we sat down and they said these results from the MRI, they are consistent with this group of diseases called mucopolysaccharidosis. Unbeknownst to us, we got our MRI done at NYU Langlong. Those guys knew exactly what they were looking at when they saw Jonah's bone deformity in his brain, this J-shaped cella, the lesions on his brain, the various vascular spaces. They said, this kid's got an MPS. We went to the right place. These guys did clinical trials where they were the radiologist teams that were already on trials for MPSs. Anywhere else, we would not have gotten a diagnosis like that. They would not have been able to put those pieces together. So
you might not have known for years later.
Oh, years. Jonah is the youngest child to have ever been diagnosed asymptomatic without an older brother or sister being diagnosed first.
So yeah, and that's a big difference between me having my son's diagnosis at 10 and a half versus Jill having it at the beginning of life at age 2. And that's kind of a really interesting question I sometimes ask myself. Would I have wanted to have it earlier or later?
I know.
I don't really know the answer to that. I don't know if you've ever thought of that, Jill, too.
Well, absolutely. And
she's a mother of a child, of course.
Without a doubt, without a doubt, you compare Jonah and Connor. Jonah still has his full speech. And because of his early diagnosis, we didn't know he couldn't hear. He, just like any 1-year-old, he had ear infections, okay? And then our other pediatrician was like, that's what babies do. They get ear infections, right? So our diagnosis said, okay, MPSs cause hearing loss. You need to go and get this checked out. In our ENT, they didn't mess around. They put grommets in his ears and the fluid just whoosh, rushed out. And so he could hear now. He's 2, the formidable years when you are learning speech and language development, he could start it here. So Jonah now has great speech. Okay, that early diagnosis saved his speech and allowed us to hit the ground running. So when you ask me if I would have wanted to know when I was 1, he was 1 without a doubt, hands down. It let us know where to live, what careers we should pursue, our children. We could have had back-to-back children. These were all things that this early diagnosis saved us from. no matter when you get that diagnosis, it's going to be brutal.
Hey,
So,
Jill, you mentioned the hearing loss. I know, Connor has since been diagnosed with mild to moderate hearing loss too. In your experience, have you seen that almost all of these kids have hearing loss early on and that affects
Yeah.
their speech in a big way? Is that
yes. Oh,
very common?
absolutely.
Yeah.
You can't hear, you're not learning speech. And so what
Right.
it is that they just have fluid sitting in their middle ear, and it's basically you're underwater.
Yeah.
That's how our kids are hearing, is muffled. Like you look at Sanfilippo kids, how they grab their parents' heads and pull them so they can look at you. That's not them being aggressive and demanding attention. That's them looking at your face to try to understand, communicate, and understand what you're saying.
We were told over and over again by our pediatrician, yeah, he doesn't need the tubes. He'll kind of grow out of it or something. Finally, we go to a different doctor. They're like, he needs tubes ASAP.
I don't even understand why they would tell that to a typical family too, because if your child has hearing infections before, like in those early years, 1 to 4, they can't hear. And you're setting them up for failure at that point. So we got this crazy diagnosis very fast. Most of these kids don't get diagnosed, the Sanfilippo type C, around 6 years of age. We asked her, is this a death sentence? And she came back and she said, it doesn't have to be. The diseases right now that we never thought were possible of treating now have treatments. And that's all I needed to hear. And we went home, put Jonah down. We started Googling, went after PubMed, found the few scientists in the world that were working on Sanfilippo syndrome. I called them up, and our main researcher, Alexei Pazhetsky in Montreal, was climbing the Himalayas somewhere. He was out of the country for like a month, and he called me back, and finally called me back like a month later, and he's like, Jill, I'm just now getting your voicemail, and what's going on? And I told him. He's like, well, I always wanted to go after this disease. How can I help? And I said, well, how can I help you? And he's like, we need a mouse model. And honestly, I just needed a family to say, hey, go for it. And I was like, well, here we are, go for it. And we started fundraising, and we got him a postdoc. He started the mouse model a year later, to the day, almost within the same week. We had our first patient population meeting at Columbia Presbyterian in New York. We had 4 or 5 families come, international families come, 3 doctors come, and 3 researchers come. And we sat down and we hammered it out. What were the best options to go after for this treatment? And that was substrate reduction, a gene therapy, enzyme replacement therapy is actually off the table for Sanfilippo syndrome type C. We all walked away. Everybody had their marching orders. The families went out and started fundraising, putting together a patient population. First on our end was to put together a patient population, find these guys, find them, pull them together, and prove to pharma that you had the patients that want a treatment. And then the researchers went home and they started putting out calls for postdocs, and we started fundraising, and we started giving them grants. So there's 4 enzymes or 4 genes that cause Sanfilippo syndrome, and there's all kinds of different mutations out there. It can be totally cut off. The valve is completely shut. This enzyme is not there. And that enzyme is supposed to break down a substrate called heparan sulfate. And this heparan sulfate has a job to do in the body. And once it's done, it's supposed to be recycled by this enzyme and goes out through the urine, right? It's gone, it's eaten up, it's gone. But so we don't have that enzyme. That substrate is not eaten up, and it sits in the lysosome of every single cell. And type C of the 4 subtypes is our enzyme is membrane bound. So it's stuck in the lysosome. It doesn't get to move out. Where the other 3 subtypes, the enzyme gets to move out, secrete itself to the other cells, right? So that limits our choices, our opportunities for different treatments. So we've got to get something that will get into the cell and be able to spread itself. And that's where gene therapy comes in, where you're using a vector, a virus, which spreads itself. And so you use the virus as a capsule for the enzyme. So we're creating the enzyme out of the body, manufacturing it, and putting it in the vector, and then putting that whole package into the body.
So is your goal to replace the genes that are to actually replace the genes that are dysfunctional and in a way to generate this enzyme on an ongoing basis? How does that actually work?
So you're going to deliver the enzyme into the body, where the enzyme is now going to eat up the substrate, the heparan sulfate, and allow the body to function normally. The enzyme replacement therapy is where we're putting the enzyme in on a monthly basis, and it keeps going in. So we believe, that's why there's the two different options, and we maintain the two different options, because maybe gene therapy will run its course and the body will stop producing the gene, and it will stop working. Our child will start regressing again. So that's why a lot of people advocate to stick with the enzyme replacement therapy, where you keep putting the gene back into the body.
I'd like to get a little bit into how it is that you ended up saying, well, you know what? I'm going to start a freaking company for this. Like, you know, what was the decision process that said, I'm going to take the lead to such a degree, I'm actually going to set up an entire research organization?
It was probably, into this 2-3 years, and working our butts off, trying to grassroots fundraising. And it's hard. Fundraising is extremely hard. It's like hosting a wedding 4 times a year for 200 people, and then you have to get up there and you have to do your sob story each and every time. It's emotionally draining, it's physically draining, and you're only walking away with, $5,000 to $20,000.
Right.
And
for that, you had to bare your soul on stage. Yeah, I remember.
Yes,
that.
and also, take that time off, and you can only tap into your supporters so many times, and this is not a quick fix. We're starting from scratch here. And so we're going to be in this for the long haul. So I saw that, and then also knew that I was also going to have to provide all the research, lay the groundwork to get pharmaceutical companies interested, de-risk all the research. And I was like, where are these dollars going to come from? There's these grants, the NIH, National Institute of Health, creates research seed funding grants for diseases. We did this. I created the company, and then we wrote some grants, and we were successful, and it was a few $100,000. And then once you're in the door, you could do a phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. So
Jill, how did you even know how to write a grant? Like, did you personally?
I didn't. There's just no way, Mike. It would take me 20 years of an education to be able to write one of these grants. I mean, I'm pretty close to that now, 12 years later, but I couldn't do it from the beginning. They are very structured. There's a format to do it. The science behind it was just above my head at that point. It was too much. So this gentleman that I met who had a lot of experience writing grants, had NIH grants under his belt, wrote them for me. So basically I brought the research. I had everything lined up. I had the package there, but they sort it. And these guys are out there for freelance. You can hire people like this. This is lessons learned. There is just so
well,
much.
we'll do a whole show on that then, because frankly, if we're going to encourage people to do this, because I think that what you've tapped into is something very interesting from my point of view, because it's taking a much more direct, outcome-oriented approach. We should just set up a company that goes out, seeks specific funding to do a task-oriented outcome, rather than waiting for somebody else to figure out that needs to be done. I think it's a wonderful way of doing it. Let's say that your trials proceed and you get positive feedback. We're still talking about years before you get a viable treatment for inhuman use. And that's got to weigh on you, because you're doing this to save your son. And yet the clock is ticking in some fashion.
Yeah, it does weigh on me hardcore. And I am here today because of all the parents, the wonderful, wonderful people that I have met along this path. We've lost a lot of kids over the years. And it's kind of one of those things where I'm in it for the long run. And if not for my child, then for the next generation. I get it now. I get it, what we're up against here. And I just kind of bury it. For Jonah's wise, I just kind of bury it. And what can I do? Except for do what I'm doing, because either way, the outcome is death.
Right. Yeah, like to do nothing and to have that happen. Or, I mean, even if you're paying it forward in the end, at least
then he has a
you're
legacy.
doing something. You have a legacy. Yeah, that's an excellent way of looking at it. That's very
Yeah, I think all Sanfilippo parents have sort of had to force themselves to get there, to get into that mindset of I'm in it for the long run, and I'm going to help build upon the legacy of my child and contribute to the ultimate cause, the ultimate solution for Sanfilippo syndrome, in our case, type C. And, speaking of, hearing, we hear about deaths all the time, we're on social media.
God, it just sucks. Like,
and it's
could you
just
ever
like
imagine how many, like, you knew somebody that lost a child when we were young in high school or whatever, and it was just like, oh my God.
No, it's like every week now. And it's
Every
like,
week.
it's crazy.
Every week.
It's like a funeral every week in your head. You're like, and every one of these crushes you. One day I was driving to work and I said, you know what? I just have to go meet Jill in person to see, like, what is this biotech? Like, who is she? What's her kid like? I had never met another Sanfilippo kid. That instant bond. And it's like, you see these parents on social media, they're meeting up with other parents. They're going across state lines. They're just like, we got to connect. Like, and it's just so important for your mental health, but also for the movement itself. It has to be a numbers game that you grow and grow and grow. And that's on the advocacy side, fundraising side, and just like your mental health, just to have somebody else to talk to, email, communicate with.
These are the people that keep me going. Like, honestly, at this point, if it was just for me and my son and my husband, I would have quit. Like, this job is it's killing me. It's killing me. But we got it started. We're going to finish it up.
The title of our podcast series is called From the Front Lines, being that parents are in this war to save their children's lives. And my goodness, like every part of that conversation that you guys just talked to me about validates that feeling. You have losses. This is a war. You're losing your children. You have a band of brothers. You have these group of people that
no soldier left behind is my motto. And I know how hard it is to get across the finish line. I mean, you think the science is the hard part? The science is actually the easy part.
Which is really, really depressing.
It's really depressing. And the money, it takes profound amount of money to pay for the management, the CROs, everything that goes into putting together a pre-IND package, labeling, all of it, licensing fees, the lawyers. Now that I understand from a company perspective, and these guys are hemorrhaging money, and they're just hanging on because they do want to help the patient population. But now it's time for them they're going under, they're going bankrupt. And we have seen that, how many companies that we have seen almost go bankrupt, and then others that needed to divest because they just couldn't afford our disease anymore. And the families all think, oh, it's money, it's greed, it's money. And you know what? It's not. I've seen it now at this point. These guys were they were trailblazers, and they had to educate the FDA, and they didn't understand the disease themselves, and they got in over their heads.
In an ideal world, we'd be able to create a rare disease company that via some combination of early grants or family support or whatever it may be, would generate a large enough non-dilutive funding base that the company could at least be a profitable entity as a going concern, not because we want to generate huge amounts of money, but because the only way that entity is going to continue to exist through time is if they can hit to a pathway where it's at least self-supporting, right?
Yeah.
So is there some kind of generalizable framework that we could create that almost becomes a
Absolutely.
cookie cutter for
Yes.
that allows a pathway to
And the
self-support at least?
the NIH, the National Institute of Health, is doing this. It might, be a little bit behind the scenes, but they've pulled together, the key opinion leaders, consultants in this space and said, we see gene therapy as being the cure, the end all to be all. And how can we help streamline this, because then you have all the proprietary information, all the data that these researchers have created.
And
Yeah.
thank you everyone for joining us on our first episode of From the Front Lines with Mike Dobbin as your host and me as your co-host. And Jill, thank you so much for joining us. We're definitely going to have you back because I'd love to talk more about your company, your pathways, and some of the ways that other parents could maybe try to do the same thing for their own children.
Yeah.
That sounds like an awfully big job, but you've maybe shown us the way forward, which would be wonderful.
Yeah, it's okay. It's not, it can be done. It can be done. It's just
A lot of
exhausting.
work, but it can be done. All right. You just need the right attitude and a hell of a lot of energy, huh?
Yeah. Hey,
Jill-
Jill, thanks so much for joining us. I know you're extremely busy trying to save our kids' lives. And we appreciate it big time in the Sanfilippo community. What you're doing is a Herculean, unimaginable task for the average, person out there. And I just believe quite firmly that this is a teamwork thing. And we just need as many people in on this, working together, figuring out what their roles are, and,
It takes a village.
making it happen. It takes a village. I agree. So
Okay.
thanks again.
Thanks for having me. We'll talk soon.
Awesome,
Okay.
guys. Thanks.
Bye.